I was told right before I started that this is the geographical attendee map, and I am just completely flattered that people outside of California are interested in this information. I think it could be interesting to you because California is, as many people know, is just a trendsetter in a lot of issues, legislative issues and regulatory issues around the country. And some of the trends that start in California might end up in your states at some point as well. California, you may know, was the first state in the country to get a marriage and family therapist license in 1964. So we really are quite established and like I said, really set trends around the country. So welcome to everybody near and far. Just to go over what we'll talk about today, I'm going to give you some legislative updates from California, of course, some of the BBS happenings, which is our regulatory board here in California, some of CAMF's statewide priorities as the Professional Association for Marriage and Family Therapists, and then some shameless promotion about some of our activities that we're doing here in California. So first with state legislation, January 7th was when the California legislature reconvened for the first year of their two-year cycle. There were 38 new assembly members and 1 new senator who had no prior legislative experience. So this is a really great opportunity to build relationships with some new members in the legislature. These members, under a new proposition that was passed by the California voters, changed term limits. So now these legislators can serve up to 12 years in one office. So there's a lot of new people and new ideas up in Sacramento. All bills for this legislative cycle were introduced by February 22nd, and as you can imagine or may not imagine, most of those bills were introduced on February 21st or 22nd. So there is just a mound of information that we are wading through. Hundreds and hundreds of bills get introduced at the very end of the cycle. To follow CAMF's positions on the bills that are of interest to marriage and family therapists, you can go to our website, which is www.camft.org. There's a tab along the top that says Advocacy, and when you drop down there, there's a Legislative Action Center. This is open to anyone, members and non-members, and then within that Legislative Action Center, you can see what the bills are that we are watching and supporting and opposing, so you can get a sense of what we deem the importance of these bills and how we're going to proceed on them. You can also subscribe on this part of the website to get alerts or action alerts. We use this pretty rarely, recognizing that our members' time is precious, so we don't want to fill your inbox with lots of stuff, but it's really a great way in recognition that you're not going to always go to our website and look for some action on what's happening on various pieces of legislation. When there is something of great importance, we will push something out to you through these action alerts. So feel free to subscribe, and again, that could be for members or non-members. So moving on to the CAMFT bills, every year CAMFT sponsors legislation. We're fortunate enough for many decades we've always been able to introduce legislation that has really shaped the industry. So this year we have 3 pieces of legislation that were introduced. The first piece is called AB 268. It was introduced by Assemblymember Holden. And basically what this does is clarify what we believe was just an omission in existing law. Existing law authorizes a healthcare provider to provide a summary of the patient's record for the patient. But it left off referencing that the patient's representative could also get a summary. And it's kind of bringing in what the legislative intent, what we believe the legislative intent was of the bill, which references broadly patients and patients' representatives. And so for some reason in this provision, it left off that a patient's representative could get a summary instead of all the records. And for many practitioners, there's very good clinical reasons why a summary could be more beneficial actually for the patient or the patient's representative than the actual stack of records, which they are also is also one of the options. So this, we think, is just clarifying what the legislative intent was. We think it's really good for patients and for patient reps. Like I said, a summary is often a clear, concise summary of the diagnosis, the treatment, and the key pieces that somebody would want to know about the care. The next bill is SB 282. This was introduced by Senator Yee. Currently, if a physician or surgeon is served with a pre-litigation demand letter, the letter must include authorization to disclose medical information to the insurer who is responsible for the professional liability of the physician or surgeon. The purpose is so that the insurer can evaluate the merits of the case. There's no such provision for LMFTs, and so what this bill does would require that authorization to disclose the information would accompany a demand letter if an LMFT is about to be in litigation. It just absolves the therapists of worrying about whether and how to disclose the records. It's just a blanket authorization so that they can take care of that right at the beginning of this process. And again, for whatever reason, the law was just written to include physicians and surgeons. This would just add LMFTs to those people who would have to, for plaintiffs, would have to sign off on authorization. And then the last bill is SB 578. This was introduced by Senator Weiland. This is actually a really interesting bill, I think. It has to do with unprofessional conduct and dual relationships. Existing law lets the Board of Behavioral Sciences, the regulatory board in California, impose discipline if a licensee or registrant engages in unprofessional conduct. Everybody kind of knows that. But what this bill does was specify what is unprofessional conduct with regards to a dual relationship. And specifically, that a dual relationship would be unprofessional conduct if it is reasonably likely to impair the provider's professional judgment or lead to exploitation of the patient. And it's a really important distinction. It provides that when a dual relationship can't be avoided, there are steps that the therapist is supposed to take. You're supposed to take professional precautions to ensure that your judgment is not impaired and the patient is not exploited. So what this does, it's a very important distinction. It does not say that all dual relationships are unethical and could lead to discipline. It just says if there is a dual relationship where there is a chance that your professional judgment is impaired or could lead to exploitation, that would be subject to unprofessional conduct and discipline. So it's a really important distinction, and it came about, there was a case that we were tracking where an MFT was under investigation and there was a hearing, and the BBS expert actually said that all dual relationships are unethical. And that really raised a red flag to us, because if a BBS expert is saying that, how many other people are confused as to what is a dual relationship and what would be unethical? So that's sort of what led to the idea to pursue this legislation. And I think it's a really important piece to know. If you are potentially subject to unprofessional conduct, better for you to have an idea of how that could be defined in terms of a dual relationship. So I think this is going to be a really interesting piece of legislation as it moves through. The BBS itself also sponsors legislation each year. A couple of pieces of their legislation I wanted to focus on is AB 428, which was introduced by Assemblyman Eggman. Currently, LMFTs must complete specific coursework as part of your degree program in order to become licensed. In certain cases, if a course is missing from the degree at the end of the process, at the end where the person graduates and a course is missing, specifically alcoholism or spousal and partner abuse, there is no way for that person to remediate that coursework. It's really, really unfortunate situation. Fortunately, it doesn't happen very often, but there have been times in the past where someone has graduated without that coursework, unbeknownst to them that it was required and the school didn't provide it. So this is just a really important catch-all for those people who were in the past caught up in this cycle that they were not allowed to remediate. This proposal will allow an LMFT applicant to remediate certain coursework deficiencies, and it also clarifies that LCSW applicants could remediate certain coursework deficiencies. So this is important just cleanup, that it should have, somehow it just wasn't ever addressed. And then the next bill is a bill that we're not too happy about. This is called AB 958. This has to do with child custody evaluators. Right now, the way it works is that the court can use a marriage and family therapist to conduct a child custody evaluation and file a written confidential report on his or her evaluation in the proceedings. Existing law right now says that the BBS can only get that report if they demonstrate good cause, meaning the Attorney General must go in and demonstrate good cause for the court to release this confidential document, or the other way that the BBS could potentially have information about it is if one of the parties challenges that the report was biased and the court holds a hearing with that evaluator to determine if the evaluator was biased in his or her opinion. We believe that these are significant safeguards and yet opportunities for the BBS to get information about people who are potentially conducting themselves inappropriately. The BBS is arguing that no, we need access to that report. We can't go through those channels and wait for those reports to possibly be released or for us to get other information about this evaluator. And so what this law does would basically require courts to disclose these confidential child custody reports to the BBS so that the BBS can investigate whether or not there is inappropriate conduct on the part of the evaluator. CAMFT is going to vigorously oppose this bill. We're very concerned about confidentiality. And like I said, we believe that there already are adequate avenues for the BBS to get information about evaluators where there's potential inappropriate conduct. So we really just don't like the idea of the BBS just getting complete, unfettered access to these confidential court documents at any time. So this is a pretty serious concern for us, and we will be fighting this one vigorously. Some other bills of interest that were proposed in this flurry at the end of February. The first one has to do was in response to the 2012 tragedy in Connecticut. There were a few bills that were introduced having to deal with taxation on ammunition, to fund mental health programs, or they call it a bullet tax. And there's a couple of bills like that out there. This one is probably the most controversial. SB 127, introduced by Senator Gaines. Current law prohibits a person that a court determines to be danger to others because of a mental disorder from possessing a firearm. But the current law allows another court to render an adjudication and certificate that the person may subsequently own a firearm. So basically, one court says, you're a danger because of your mental disorder. We're taking away your right to have a gun for now. And later on, at some point, if the person wants to go back to court, another court can undo that and they can demonstrate that they are fit to have a firearm. Truthfully, I don't know how many times one court will say take away that right because of the person's mental disorder, and then another court reinstate it. I can't imagine it happens very often, but it's an important safeguard there, so that there is not a lifetime ban for someone being able to possess firearms. This bill would basically take away the right for another court to subsequently issue a certificate for the person to get a firearm. So it's very controversial. CAMFT has not taken a position on this, but I can just tell you it's a very controversial bill. Many people in the mental health community are concerned about the stigma that would get attached to somebody if you assign a lifetime ban. But at the same time, as you can see, the courts are doing this only for people who have serious mental disorders who are a danger. So it's very controversial. What we are expecting is this bill will kind of quietly just go away and never really come up for a vote, because it is just highly controversial. And as you can see, the current law does have safeguards in there to protect the public, certainly. The other bill that we're looking at and supporting is SB 22, introduced by Senator Beal. This is a really important bill that requires all insurers and plans to comply with state and federal mental health parity laws. These laws were designed to end health insurance benefits inequity between the mental health and the physical health benefits at health plans. The part that was interesting to me is that there is already a law that says plans must have parity. They can't have different standards for the health benefits versus the mental health benefits. What I learned is that there actually has to be legislation to make sure that that law is enforced. So this is kind of part two to that. Now it's saying, okay, all the plans have to have parity, but now this bill says, and it actually has to be enforced. So this bill would require a plan, a health insurer, to provide an analysis of their compliance with the law, and they have to use certain mental health parity standards. They have to conduct surveys with enrollees, insured, and providers as part of this public annual report. So it obviously makes higher degree of accountability and transparency. I think it's a really good idea to involve providers in this process, so that the providers can actually, you're the ones on the front line. You can tell whether or not there really is parity. Are you having to jump through hoops to get authorizations that a physical health doctor would not have to jump through? And so it's really good that the providers would be part of this process in creating this annual reports to prove compliance. And then the next bill I just want to mention was a bill from last year. It's called SB 1172. It was passed actually in 2012. What this bill does is prohibits mental health providers from engaging in sexual orientation change efforts on a minor under 18 years of age. The bill was passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, and then almost immediately was challenged in two district courts. The two district courts came out with conflicting rulings. One court found that the plaintiffs were likely to succeed on their merits based on the violation of freedom of speech, and granted an injunction to those three plaintiffs that the law would not apply to them until it was further resolved. The other court found that there is no fundamental or privacy right to choose a specific mental health treatment that the state has reasonably deemed to be harmful to minors. Two completely different opinions. As a result, the case gets escalated to the U.S. 9th District Court of Appeals, who will ultimately decide this law's fate. On December 21st of last year, that Circuit Court of Appeals granted an emergency motion to temporarily block the law from going into effect for all practitioners on January 1st. So that was previously was supposed to happen. It is temporarily blocked. The Court of Appeals set an expedited briefing schedule and will hear preliminary injunction appeals the week of April 15th. So this is really important. It's just an interesting and important piece of legislation to watch, and we will keep people posted as we hear the hearing at the week of April 15th, when there are the preliminary injunction appeals hearings on this law. But I just thought it was worth mentioning so you know the status of it. So now moving on to Washington. CAMFT is involved in a couple of different areas in Washington. The first one is Medicare. This is something that CAMFT has been working on for many years, actually 11 years to be exact. The idea is that we want to fight to get LMFTs, actually, and we're working in partnership with the LPCC organizations, to get LMFTs and LPCCs included as Medicare providers. The argument is very clear, and quite frankly, we don't have any pushback on our argument. The argument is there's a great mental health need in the Medicare community, and there are simply not enough providers out there. And so if you add in the workforce of LMFTs coupled with LPCCs around the country, many more of our mental health, of our Medicare beneficiaries will get mental health care. And quite frankly, as you can attest better than I can, treating someone's psychosocial problems will help their physical health. Obviously, will keep them out of the hospital. I was just reading an example the other day of when someone goes into the hospital, the issues that they're complaining about, their physical issues, after they run the battery of tests, boils down to there's some sort of depression. And so instead of going through all that expense and all that, and quite frankly, the burden it places on the Medicare beneficiary, better to let people get their mental health, more access to mental health early on, will save the government money and will actually be better for the health of the beneficiaries. So it's a really good argument. And quite frankly, no one says that's a bad argument. The problem is that it costs money to add more providers into Medicare. And when they do the scoring that they do in Washington, they're estimating it will cost about $100 million over 5 years to add LMFTs and LPCCs in as Medicare providers. Now, quite frankly, in Washington, they call that a rounding error. It's not a lot of money in that world. Of course, it's a lot of money to the rest of the world, but it's still enough money there that a lot of members of Congress say, I'm not touching this bill. That's their only argument, is that it's going to cost money. What they fail to acknowledge is that the money it's going to save. Like we just talked about, that same Medicare beneficiary goes to the ER and they run a battery of tests and ultimately conclude there's nothing wrong with her physical health, but she's suffering from repercussions of depression. What a tremendous waste of resources there. So no one's looking at what would be saved from that person having gone and had a regular therapist that she could speak to. So the savings are never really addressed. They just talk about the cost. So it's just a battle that we keep fighting. We keep pushing it. I can tell you that it takes Medicare providers historically decades to get into Medicare. It took the psychologists 13 years of lobbying in Washington. It took, I think it was the psychiatric nurses, about 20 years of lobbying. So we're going into year 12. So if that makes you feel any better, we're kind of on track. But it's just sort of the process and explaining and dealing with the perceptions of what it means. There was actually a period of time where we were having to explain. There were people who would say, well, why should Medicare beneficiaries get marriage counseling? Things that we had to really undo the perception of what a marriage and family therapist does and how you are trained to diagnose and treat a variety of mental disorders. So we're kind of past that hump now, but that took time. So I really do believe it will happen. It's just, as I say, we need the moon and the stars to be aligned. But like I said, because we don't have true opposition, there's really not a good argument against it. I just think it's just a matter of getting all our ducks in a row, the right members of Congress aligned and on board. And so every year, CAMFT members go to Washington and sort of advocate on this from a practitioner standpoint, which I think is very, very useful. As the executive director and our lobbyists, there's only so much we can do when we speak on the issues, but I think having a practitioner there talking about how they see Medicare beneficiaries, and they do it pro bono because the Medicare beneficiary doesn't have funds to pay out of pocket, and yet their insurance won't cover it. And it's just these heartbreaking stories. And quite frankly, MFTs are not, that's not your job, is to subsidize Medicare beneficiaries and their mental health treatments. It's absurd. So, so having the practitioners talk about how constituents are impacted by not having access to mental health coverage to the extent they could be having access is really helpful. One of CAMP's strategies is also to expand our reach to non-California legislators to make sure that they're aware of this issue too. It's obviously not just a California issue. And so we do have a federal PAC, a political action committee, and we have donated to candidates around the country to make sure that they are aware of this issue and would be a friend of ours in Washington if they get elected. So that's another part of our bigger strategy on Medicare. The next issue in Washington, it has to do with the Department of Veterans Affairs. This is another really frustrating situation. Several years ago, legislation said that LMFTs could work in the Department of Veterans Affairs. And then basically it sort of shipped it off to the Department of Veterans Affairs to define the standards, what that would require, what a person would have to, what standards they'd have to meet to work there. It sounded like no problem. And then unilaterally, the Department of Veterans Affairs issued these job standards. And what showed up on these job standards would said, yes, LMFTs can work at Department of Veterans Affairs if they meet the following requirements, one of which says you have to be a graduate of a CAMFT accredited school. Now, CAMFT accreditation is a relatively new accreditation relative to other accreditations. It came about, I believe it was in the late 70s. Keep in mind, California got the license for LMFT in the 60s. So every school that has been in business since the 60s would likely not have the CAMFT accreditation just because they got accredited by another body at the time they came into existence. CAMFT accreditation is just not as popular in California or in any of the bigger states. It's just schools choose other accreditations, regional and so forth. So we have gone in conjunction with AAMFT to the Department of Veterans Affairs for the last few years and said, this is the wrong standard. And by imposing this standard, you're effectively eliminating, let's just say California, 95% of MFTs in California would be not eligible to apply for jobs because they are not CAMFT accredited graduates. And the numbers are stunning. Even in New York and Florida, I mean, it's the vast majority of LMFTs are precluded. And in fact, the numbers show that right now, I think there's something like 68 or something like that, 68 LMFTs working for the Department of Veterans Affairs out of their mental health workforce of 21,000 people. So clearly this is a barrier to employment, and who suffers but the veterans who are coming back with all of these mental health problems. You can't open a newspaper without seeing the sad stories of people who are waiting for treatment and can't get access. And yet the Department of Veterans Affairs has effectively eliminated a huge chunk of the mental health workforce from being eligible for positions. So it's a travesty. And the Department of Veterans Affairs has just been unwilling to change that standard despite our best efforts. So now we're working with congressional officials to sort of make sure that they're aware of this and see what influence they could have over the Department of Veterans Affairs. Again, we've been working on this issue for a couple of years, and you know, this one is really very frustrating because you're caught in this bureaucracy and they want a standard, and so what we are trying to do is come up with other appropriate gold standards to hold an LMFT. Certainly we're not saying you shouldn't have any standards, but what is an appropriate standard that will not be an artificial barrier to employment? So that's the other big issue that our board of directors will be dealing with in Washington and that our lobbyist in Washington deals with on a daily basis. I want to take a minute now just to shift to what I call the Covered California Corner. This is basically what the California Health Benefits Exchange, the implementation of the Affordable Care Act in California. And for people in other states around the country, your exchanges could be called different names, but they all sort of started with started out as health benefits exchanges. So Covered California has a mission to increase the number of insured Californians, improve healthcare quality, lower costs, and reduce health disparities through an innovative, competitive marketplace that empowers the consumer to choose the health plan and providers that give them the most value. Beginning in October 1st, 2013, Californians will have access to the online Covered California portal to shop for health insurance covered. What they are expecting that by 2019, when this Affordable Care Act is fully implemented, so you're talking 5 years from when it rolls out in 2014, they expect 5 million people in California who do not have coverage today to be covered by health insurance. It's quite staggering and pretty incredible. In the months ahead, the Covered California is going to be choosing health plan offerings and testing their online enrollment process. But one of the key factors, which I bring it up here, is because Covered California intends to ensure that plans in California have sufficient providers to meet the needs of enrollees. And they're going to monitor existing regulatory mechanisms to assess the capacity, which they call network adequacy. So as millions of people file into our covered insurance world, they have to have enough providers to meet those needs. So CAMFT sees this as a potential opportunity for members who do want to serve on insurance panels. There's going to be a whole lot more people covered who are going to need mental health access. And under the parity laws that I talked about a few minutes ago, they have to have access to mental health at the same degree that they have access to physical health. So it is potentially a great opportunity for mental health providers to provide their services. So coverage under these plans starts January 1st, 2014, and I can tell you that California is I think the leading state on this, further out ahead than most states, because we adopted the concepts of the Affordable Care Act very quickly, and we were not one of the states that waited to see what the Supreme Court was going to do. So we're quite ahead of the 8 ball here. Now I'm going to shift gears to the BBS, the Board of Behavioral Sciences. This is the regulatory board in California that regulates the LMFT license. Just a few points about them. The GAP exam, which is the exam that people who are licensed as an LMFT who wanted to add an LPCC license, they had a period of time where they could grandparent into that license. Part of the requirements was that they had to take a GAP exam, which would sort of test on the gaps between the LMFT licensing exam and the LPCC licensing exam. In mid-January, quite suddenly, the BBS suspended the GAP exam until further notice in order to conduct further quality assurance of the items. I don't know what it means, but I do know that the test is currently not being offered, which has led to mass confusion among the people who are waiting to take the test. The BBS has assured anyone who is in that queue to take the test or has a clock running, because they have 1 year to correct their deficiencies if they've gotten this notice, that they'll have a day added on to the end of their expiration for every day that the exam is not offered. So I think the exam went off maybe around January 18th or so, and it's still not in place, and they're saying it might not be until June. So effectively, people are going to get another 6 months tagged on to the end of their expiration to complete the exam. But they are working on a brand new exam, as I understand. The next bit of sort of frustrating news is that the MFT exam application process is still very, very backlogged. Anyone who is in that process, who has gotten all their hours and is waiting to take their exam, it's just a very frustrating place. And it's frustrating all the way around. I can tell you that the BBS has been left in a really difficult position. 2 years ago, there were hiring freezes, and they had one of their evaluators left. They couldn't fill the position through no fault of their own, and therefore the backlog just got worse and worse and worse. They are now fully staffed in that department, but digging out from that hole is it's unbelievable, the numbers that they're talking about, because every time they try to dig out, there's still an influx of people sending in their applications. They are trying to get creative ways to kick out that backlog. They're trying to bring other staff in to sort of do the administrative part of the review, but unfortunately, the review is very technical. They are making sure that the person has met all the requirements to take the exam. And so it's a very long process for each evaluation. So through no fault of their own, the BBS is very backlogged. They're working, when I wrote this a couple weeks ago, they're working on applications received mid-September. So you're talking about a 6-month wait for people, and it's just frustrating all the way around. And CAMFT is very empathetic to the frustrations, and we're constantly talking to the BBS about what are they going to do to improve this. The next piece is the Breeze online database. This is something that for people who are in school now, this is probably going to really revolutionize the way you're going to interact with the BBS on a lot of issues. This database is brand new, and which means that there's all the glitches that they're finding out now before they roll it out. It was actually intended to launch in September of 2012, and now they've delayed it at least till May of 2013. But this online system will eventually allow people to submit applications, submit renewal forms, and check the status of applications online, which will be huge, because I can't tell you how many calls we get at CAMFT with people having problems with their renewals, people who wait to the last minute, and then all of what unravels when you wait till the last minute with the renewal. So now it'll be online, just like anything else you can do online. It would be instantaneous. You would pay, you would attest to what you have to attest to, pay, and you'd be relicensed. So this is really going to be great for people who are in school now. By the time you're licensed, this had better be in place by then. The BBS has spent tons of resources on this. Not so much the financial end was sort of imposed by the Department of Consumer Affairs, but staff resources. They figured out they've spent like the equivalent of like 2 months of their staff time working on these trainings, or their mandatory trainings, because they need to be up to speed when it does roll out. So hopefully once this rolls out, it really will be just a huge relief for their staff, for the applicants, for registrants, for licensees. It will, I believe, be a really good thing when it rolls out. And then just the last piece I'll mention for students at the exam, there is an exam restructure that was passed several years ago. It was delayed until January 2014. It was supposed to go into effect this last January. But because this online database is not functioning, they couldn't roll out this new exam without it somehow is tied to the database. The data has to be able to talk to each other. And so because the database isn't ready, they had to delay the exam restructure another year. So it'll start in January 1st, 2014. LMFT applicants must take a new California Law and Ethics exam and a new clinical exam. And those replace the standard written and clinical exams that are in place today. And then the last bit of what's changing at the BBS has to do with continuing education providers. The BBS is proposing regulations to get out of the CE provider approval business. The way it works now is that the BBS approves CE providers, and then licensees take classes from those providers who have a BBS approval number. But the BBS has said we are delegating that authority to several approval agencies, which is how some other boards do it. And these approval agencies will have the responsibility to make sure that the CE providers in California have met rigorous standards, are accountable, there are audits. They have a lot more oversight than the BBS has in current regulations. So ultimately it will be a good thing, I believe, for the public. The licensees will be better educated. It'll be a good thing for licensees that your providers are going to have to jump through a lot of hoops. They're going to be credible. That's the plan. Credible. They're going to put on courses that have met, appropriate standards in terms of their objectives and so forth. So I do believe it's a good thing, but it'll be a little bit painful because there are currently providers who are authorized by the BBS. I can tell you that schools are de facto providers, meaning a school will continue to be able to put on CE for BBS licensees. So schools are not affected by that if a school is regionally accredited and so forth. The other part of the proposal that's going forward now is that it eliminates the 18-hour limitation on self-study. So currently, to renew your license, you need 36 hours every 2 years, 18 of which are limited. You can only do 18 in self-study. But the definitions of self-study were so antiquated when we started looking at these. In fact, the definition included the term, included listening to audio tapes, which I thought was kind of funny that that's even in regulation in 2013. And so it was definitely time to look at how self-study was going to be defined. And particularly to an audience like this, you can appreciate that online learning it's a whole different world than it was when these regulations were written. And how do you even define what's self-study? It can't just be what's online, because as you know, we're doing online learning today. There's no difference in whether you're live. You're able to ask questions and interact. So it's very hard to define it now, given the, how people learn. So the BBS agreed with that and said that they're not going to limit what self-study is, and instead it's going to be 36 hours. They're proposing just 36 hours at renewal in the format that you deem best to learn from, and I think that's ideally what continuing education should be about. It'll take about a year for these regulations to be finalized, and when they do go into effect, let's assume it'll be early 2014, they are delaying the implementation till July 2014, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of stuff they still have to work out, a lot of the logistics of the providers who are currently under the BBS, transitioning them to other homes and so forth. So nothing's going to change right away, but know that this is coming, and like I said, it'll make for, I believe, very very good continuing education options for licensees going forward. And then I'll just talk quickly about some of CAMP's strategic priorities. As you heard, we have 30,000 members, so we have quite a sphere of influence here in California. And a couple of the priorities here today I'm going to talk about is increasing awareness and contributions to our PAC, our political action committees. This is something that I've learned has become very near and dear to my heart because the political action committee, I understand the ickiness factor, right? Why would we want to give money to campaigns to help defray their debt? There's not a really good reason when you think about it that way. But I did a lot of research, and the real reason why I believe people need to give is because it helps CAMFT make contributions to elect and re-elect legislators who are friendly to our issues. That way, when somebody gets elected, we don't have to start from, oh, we don't only do marriage counseling. We need people who understand the bigger issues and what therapists do and help to get them elected into office. So we are very active on that scene. We have a federal PAC and a state PAC. Last year we raised more than $70,000 from our members, which is really, really good. Of course, I need to keep pushing that envelope to keep up with the number of requests we get and the number of people that we believe out there that we want to see get elected and reelected. In the last election cycle, we supported 22 people who were reelected or elected, and so we feel really good about our success record. We're also doing PAC fundraisers at our annual conference. We started that last year. Just a way for legislators to meet our members and to talk about the importance of grassroots activity, why it's important to give to political action committees what they do, and from a legislator's perspective, the benefits of that. This year we have our special guest is Assembly Member Richard Pan, who's a doctor, and he also chairs the Health Committee. So he's very relevant to LMFTs, and we think he'll be a very excellent guest at our fundraiser. The next priority that we have is retiring and adding services to keep our organization fresh. I think this is really important for every organization to always look at what are we doing, why are we doing it, do our members use these products or services? If they don't use them, how do we want to get them to use them, or do we want to just retire them and bring on new products? So that's something that's always on the forefront of my mind, very important to me. You'll see that we're going to be adding some new traditional CE opportunities. Again, I'm preaching to the choir here because you already are adopters of the concept of online learning, but there are a lot of LMFTs who are not, have not embraced that way of learning yet. So it's something that we're going to be exploring. We are a statewide organization, and by doing live conferences twice a year, an annual conference and a workshop or a fall symposium, we can only touch so many people. So I do believe we have an obligation to offer lots of different ways for people to get CE through CAMFT, and we're going to be exploring that this in coming years. CAMFT is proposing significant bylaw changes. Those proposals are going to the board next week when we meet in Washington. They were drafted with a committee of members with an eye towards the next 50 years. CAMFT is celebrating its 50th anniversary next year. The bylaws are 50 years old, and it really is time to instead of just making various amendments and sort of putting Band-Aids on and tweaking language, it really is time to modernize the bylaws, and like I said, look towards what do we want CAMFT as an organization to look like over the next 50 years. So these proposals will go to the members for a vote. It's obviously a very important vote, and that vote will probably be in June, with the ballots going out sometime in May or April. So anyone who is a member, stay tuned for that. And then the last strategic priority, which I also feel was very important, was from 2012 we created what I call a Perview committee. And this committee is designed to evaluate whether requests for CAMFT to take positions on social and public policy issues are within the range of operation or concern for CAMFT, whether they are under CAMFT's purview. We haven't had a good vehicle for getting these issues brought to the board and getting vetted. And so now this is a channel for some of these issues to go through a committee of peers, practitioners serving on this committee, to sort of vet, do these issues fall within what CAMFT's mission and purview is, and make recommendations to the board. The board ultimately still makes that decision, but now it's just a cleaner process and gets more people in the mix in making those decisions, or at least those recommendations. And then the shameless promotion. I can't go anywhere without promoting what CAMFT does. We have counselingcalifornia.com, which is our public-facing website. So CAMFT.org is really designed for our members and LMFTs to use. Counseling California is designed for the consumer. It's free for our clinical members to post their profile, and it's a directory for the consumer to use. We currently have about 8,500 profiles on it, and we spend a lot of resources on doing search engine optimization so that people who do post on it with their profile, when someone searches for, eating disorders in Irvine, ideally our website and the names of our members who are on our website will pop up. So we spend a lot of resources on that. I strongly encourage anyone who is one of our clinical members to certainly sign up for that. We have a CAMFT Community, which is our intranet for special interest groups to sort of meet virtually and discuss various trends in the industry. We have a behind the scenes column. That's on our website as well under About Us. And I created this about 2 years ago when I started because it became very clear to me that CAMFT does so much behind the scenes. At the end of the day, your members are going to see, we have three pieces of legislation introduced, but what you don't see behind the scenes is all the coalition meetings all the coalition building we're doing, and all the letters we're writing, and all the times we're testifying, and all the PAC receptions we're going to, and all the schools that we're presenting at, and the chapters. And so it's just a quick bullet list of just quantifying all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, work done by staff and by our board. So I encourage you to pop into that now and then and see what we're doing. EBSCO Host is, I'm sure you use it through your school, and it's an amazing resource. It's a database of professional journals. When I first started, we provide this as a subscription. We've been doing this for our members, but the members weren't really using it, and it's very expensive. So I was trying to get my head around what is it, and I was playing around on it and looking around, and I said, I get it. Why Google if you can EBSCO? And that's kind of what I'm telling our members. Instead, if you have a situation, let's say you have a clinical issue, a person comes in and presents with a situation that you're not familiar with. If you Google it, the first thing that's going to come up on your Google search is, quackery.com, and then it goes down from there. But if you actually go on to our EBSCO, as a member, you're eligible to go on an EBSCO and type in the same phrase, you're going to only get full articles from professional scientific journals. So it's a fabulous research tool. Again, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir because schools offer the academic version, which is really incredible. Ours is the Behavioral Sciences Journal version, which is also quite good. 600 journals are represented there. But I always encourage our members to use it. I think it's really one of our best member benefits, and I really encourage people to use it. And then last is our CAMFT annual conference. It's May 16th through 19th in Sacramento. We have a great lineup, and so anyone who has not signed up for that, if you're interested, please do. And then I'll just make one final pitch. We're already planning for 2014's annual conference. That'll be May 1st through 4th in Palm Springs. And the theme for that conference, it's our 50th anniversary, so a golden anniversary. Is very exciting. The theme for that conference is the gold standard, integrating mental health and community. And the overall theme is about integration. It's obviously, it is the trend of the future, and we're really excited about having some excellent speakers who will address some of, bring it to life. We talk a lot about integrating mental health into physical health, into the whole health. But we're going to have some people who bring it to life and talk about how it's actually being done, along with some of the theories behind it. So if you know of anyone who's interested in that, or anyone interested in presenting any kind of topic, the call for proposals is due April 1st. So with that said, thank you for your attention, and for everyone around the country and world for listening in, and I'll take some questions.
Great, thank you so much. I guess I'll start with some from the online audience and give our in-person audience a chance to gather their thoughts. First question, kind of a general question. What is the process by which CAMFT develops its policies and positions regarding pending legislation? Could you kind of walk us through that, how that works?
Sure. So CAMFT has a full-time lobbyist up in Washington and in Sacramento. They're the ones who sort of collect all the information on the bills, and then they pass that information onto our office, and we sort of huddle together and analyze the bills that are going to impact CAMFT members and how and whether we should be doing anything about it. But taking one step back, the bills that I mentioned, that CAMFT sponsored, those concepts for those bills come from our members, from our legal staff who answers calls from members all the time, and our up-counsel who contemplates these issues. We pull together a massive list, and we go to the board each September and we say, here's a whole laundry list of ideas that we think could be fixed through legislation. And we have the board sort of prioritize that for us, and then we give that to the lobbyist, and he kind of shops around the priorities to get them introduced. But going back to that part of the cycle, it's very critical to have the members' input for us to know what areas need to be fixed. And I can assure you, the calls that come into our office give us a very good indication where there are problems. Great.
A similar question. Well, actually, the question regarding your Hill visits. You mentioned that CAMFT. Your board makes those visits. Do rank and file members ever have an opportunity to participate in Hill visits or visits to Sacramento?
We have not yet used that. Well, let me correct that. Last year we did have one of our practitioner members testify, and I'm a big supporter of that, and so is our lobbyist. Like I just said, there's only so much that I can spit back about an issue being important. It's far more convincing for a practitioner to explain why it's important to their practice or to their clients. So we do envision using that more, at least in having key practitioners sort of testifying on the issues. I think in my perfect world, I would love to envision a lobby day for our members. It takes a lot of time and money and coordination to pull that off, but it's definitely not off the table and something I would like to consider.
Kind of a related question regarding PAC contributions. Can you point to, in your opinion, what's the most positive outcome that you've seen as a result of those contributions and the relationships you've formed?
Well, like I said, it's just generally having friends in the legislature. It's people who understand what LMFT issues are and how mental health is a priority and needs a special attention in various legislation. I can't really draw a connection there because keep in mind it's very, very important to know that the political action committees are very separate from legislation and they can never be connected. So we are supporting candidates and building relationships with them. Great.
Just a couple more from online, and then I'll turn to our audience here. Let's see, you provided an update on SB 1172. Could you also describe what CAMF's position is on that?
Sure. When SB 1172 was introduced, there were a lot of, the way it was written was of great concern to many parts of the mental health profession, and CAMFT formed a coalition with the California Psychiatric Association, the California Psychological Association, and the California Association of Licensed Professional Clinical Counselors. And together we worked with the author and the sponsors trying to find ways to make the definitions in the language more acceptable. It was very, very challenging. I can tell you this. It was very challenging to define what is sexual orientation change efforts. It was challenging for all sides of this discussion to actually define it. Ultimately, when there was a definition on the table that we being this coalition, believed was acceptable, CAMFT and many members of the coalition at that point stepped back from the debate and just stayed neutral on the bill. CAMFT continues to have some concerns about the bill. While we support the intent of what it's trying to do, it's very difficult to legislate only bad parts out of legislation and leave the good parts untouched. And so we are concerned about some of the unintended consequences of what is legitimate therapy somehow being banned under this law. So we have some concerns, but again, we were supportive of the intent, and we certainly did nothing to preclude it. In fact, we knew that the bill would pass once we agreed on the definition. We stepped back, as did some of these other mental health groups, and just stayed neutral and watched the bill move forward.
Okay, this is a two-part question here. For context, could you provide an example or two of a dual relationship that, in your opinion, would be likely to be deemed unprofessional conduct?
Ooh. You know what? I don't want to even speculate on that now, especially as we're in the conversations with this legislation. But I would say if somebody has a specific question about a situation they're in, I encourage you to call CAMFT. We have 5 attorneys on staff who are our members and sort of get some legal guidance as to your particular situation. Sorry about that. I'm not going to touch that one.
And the second part of the question is, who makes the ultimate determination
of whether a dual relationship is unprofessional conduct? That is all from the BBS are the ones who actually impose that kind of discipline.
Okay. Any from our audience here?
Great questions, by the way.
Jill, thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm going to present a couple of questions from a different perspective.
Okay.
The first one, and being a Vietnam veteran myself, I can appreciate the needs of other friends and associates and people I serve with when they need help from the VA and can't get it. Also, although I hate to admit it, I qualify for Medicare as well. But in any case, I'm in the business program here, and I'm also an attorney and an accountant, an attorney and accountant in other aspects. Oh. But my question to CAMFT, when you make a presentation or lobby Congress, and the feedback is it's going to cost too much money, $100 million, do you have a professional accountant on staff who would put together a schedule which would detail the savings involved of your recommendations? and therefore you have some concrete data that can be used to, let's say, refute whatever assertions are being made that the particular cost is too high to implement a very needed program. My last question is, not being in this profession, I apologize for that, by the way, but and not yet. I'm being lobbied in that regard here by certain people at the university, which I have not. I won't mention any names, but anyway, we all have a nice relationship here. Could you tell me what the CAMFT certification is, and
Sure.
why the Veterans Administration, apparently, in CAMP's opinion, is so focused on that particular, let's say, the certification rather than on the certification that California provides?
Sure.
Thanks.
So to the first question about the accounting, we're part of a Medicare Access Coalition, like I said, that works with AMFT, CAMFT, the American Counseling Association, and we do have very sophisticated documents to present to members of Congress about the savings. The problem is this: in Washington, the Congressional Budget Office does a score of what a piece of legislation is going to cost, and the way it works there is they do. The way the scoring does, it just scores what it's going to cost. There is no such thing in Washington as official scoring of what it's going to save. And so we can go, I know, the person asking the question is making a face, and I know that face. It's like you want to bang your head against the wall, because it doesn't make any sense not to look at savings from in the same vein. So while we can come in with our statistics and our information, at the end of the day, they say, but the CBO score is $100 million over 5 years. And it's just a matter of having, I believe in Washington, some of the fighting that there's been between parties. I don't think it's the money thing at the end of the day. That's, I guess, my point. It's such a little amount of money in the Medicare budget. It's politics. Yes?
What I was going to say is...
Oh, wait, hold on. Who's going to follow up?
Thanks, Tom. But what I was going to say is that if a cost-benefit analysis is not properly performed and utilized, the government can't run more efficiently from an economic standpoint.
Correct.
And my other comment is that with the current climate in Washington to lower the deficit and to improve the medical benefits under the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, possibly CAMF will have an opportunity to represent something to certain members of Congress who might be listening to it more effectively now than they were in the past.
Absolutely, that's an excellent point. Our issue is such that while it's taken 11 years and it's so frustrating, we're actually in a better position than other people with their issues. And I can give you, this is what our lobbyist was telling me. If we were a different focus and a different organization had a different issue, there are issues that only get kind of bubble to the attention of congressional officials once every 6 years. So he was saying for those cases, and he's lobbied on behalf of groups in those situations, if their issue doesn't get amended into legislation that year, they sit for years and years. They can't even do anything for years. On the flip side, Medicare, as you point out, is always under review. It's always under consideration. And our provision, at the end of the day, will be added into some bigger piece of Medicare legislation. So the good news is that Medicare is always being discussed. There is always a vehicle to get our provision included in. One of the interesting vehicles that we have looked at last year, and it was included, and this year we expect a bill too, is the Rural Health Bill. And the reason why that's of great interest is that is usually not as partisan as a lot of the other bills, because there are rural districts in Republican areas and Democratic areas as well. And so that bill usually has a good amount of legs behind it. And so to your point, we are trying to be creative as to what kinds of bills can we get our provision inserted into. Answering your COAMF question, so the reason why I suspect the Department of Veterans Affairs picked COAMF as their accreditation standard is because it is the only national accreditation that I'm aware of. The other accreditations that we are suggesting are regional, so I think many California schools are regionally accredited. I think there is also sort of a more global accreditation through the U.S. Department of Education, which I think most schools are accredited by if they wanted to go broader, but we've been trying to give them, but I believe that's why they defaulted to COAMF, because it's the only national accreditation for LMFT programs. You're welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Jerry Linarius, and I'm enrolled in the MFT 86513 course. And I'm an LCSW, and I just have a quick question. I recently passed the LPCC, and I'm kind of wondering, why the changes, and if you have any further knowledge other than what you mentioned before of why there's a hold on that examination and anything else.
You know what? I have no idea. I have no idea. I've actually asked, in open session at the BBS, to share a little bit more about why the sudden cutoff, and they just said they're not at liberty to share any of the details now. So.
Is that going to impact the people that took it?
No. So people who took the LPCC GAP exam, who passed it, who are already licensed, are not in any danger at all. Not in any danger at all, is my understanding. Correct. LPCCs who passed the GAP exam, that score is still valid. That passing score is still valid. That's a great point. That's my understanding, that it's not going to impact anyone who passed it already.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and wow, I'm impressed. 3 different licenses. You're very unique. I got to talk to you after. That's well-rounded. That's a great way of putting it. A lot of school too, and exams.
To go back to the Veterans Affairs question, did they give a reason why they're holding firm? Is it because they're too busy to address this issue? Have they acknowledged that there is a that there's a problem and they'll get to it, or what is their argument? What would they be telling us right now?
The VA would be telling us there needs to be a high standard for anyone who's going to work with our veterans in our department. There needs to be a standard, and the only national standard that we can look to is the CAMFT standard, and that's kind of as far as I believe they see it. Again, what we have come back to is saying, well, what if you do a regionally accredited standard and someone is licensed and someone has passed the national LMFT exam or the California equivalent? I mean, the whole point is that we're all on the same page. We want to make sure qualified people are working for the Department of Veterans Affairs. That's our common interest. It's just, how do you define qualified? And because the government is bureaucratic and they look for the standard of being a national accreditation, they sort of can't get past or get creative enough, in my opinion, to figure out other ways to hold people to a high standard. And maybe they have other things to do.
Okay, I think you're going to like this one, a bit of a softball for you. A student is on the fence regarding CAMP membership and is wondering what, in your opinion, are the most significant benefits of CAMP membership.
Oh, well, that is a lovely question. Well, as I sort of alluded to, we have a pretty big sphere of influence. Being 30,000 members strong gives CAMFT a lot of clout in a lot of different areas. We have excellent relationships in Sacramento and with the BBS, and so and on top of that, just an outstanding staff I can speak to in San Diego. We have not only 5 attorneys who answer questions on legal and ethical issues and sort of provide guidance. We have all the back staff that you would never see who are there answering your questions. I can tell you that our attorneys alone field 23,000 questions a year. And that doesn't even count all the questions that go through our info center that get addressed there. So we're very focused on customer service, and I think that's one thing any CAMFT member would attest to. But as far as the specific benefits, obviously having access to an attorney, you pay one price for your membership, which is fairly low in the world of membership fees. You get access to attorneys as needed. Like I said, we provide that EBSCO host, the access to the database, and we have a lot of affinity partners that we provide discounts with. But again, I think part of being part of the community that has so much influence and clout in California, I think speaks volumes about why someone should join.
Okay. Last question, and if the last one was a softball, this is a high and inside fastball, I think. A student describes a belief that, with reference to SB 127, that the discussion on gun control is kind of turning towards blaming or scapegoating people with mental disorders. And this student writes that, describes a belief that there's no higher incidence of violence in that population than in the population at large. Might CAMFT be willing to enter the debate to keep those with mental disorders from being scapegoated?
That's a really good question. I don't have a great answer to that. I can tell you we did post a statement on our website after that the Biden task force came out after analyzing what happened in Sandy Hook, and we do have a statement on our website about the importance of access to mental health. As far as dipping into the gun or the violence and mental health, we haven't gone there yet, and again, I don't know whether we would. That could be something for our Perview committee to decide. But we are obviously strong advocates for access to mental health, and obviously not to stigmatize people who do seek mental health care.